The year was 1945, in the humid, dust-choked outskirts of a newly liberated POW camp in the Philippines, an isolated patch of land where barbed wire rattled softly in the wind, and the sun, already sinking behind the ruined treetops, cast long streaks of gold across the earth. American medics moved through the camp with quiet urgency, their boots sinking into mud still marked with the footsteps of soldiers, guards, and the countless prisoners who had suffered here for years. The air carried a strange mixture of smells: burnt wood from the collapsed barracks, the metallic tang of rusted tin roofs, and the stale odor of bodies that had not felt clean water in months. Inside one of the shanty barracks, dozens of Japanese women, emaciated, shaking, hair matted with sweat and dirt, sat against the walls, staring blankly at the daylight as if unsure whether this sudden safety was real or another fragile illusion. They had survived starvation, disease, humiliation, and an unending stretch of days without bathing, 6 long months where water was rationed to sips, not for washing, not for comfort, only enough to prevent death. As the American soldiers began assembling wooden partitions, hauling buckets, stringing canvas sheets, and heating water over makeshift stoves, none of the women understood what was coming. They watched silently, confused, eyes wide and hollow. For them, clean water had become a memory, a dream from a life before captivity. The idea that someone might prepare it for them, with dignity and privacy, seemed impossible. Then one medic stepped forward, gently gesturing toward the newly assembled bathhouses. This is for you." For the first time in months, a spark of disbelief flickered across their faces, hope fighting its way through exhaustion. The realization came slowly, not in a sudden gasp or a collective cry, but in tiny, fragile moments: a hesitant step, a trembling inhale, a widening of exhausted eyes that had forgotten what surprise felt like. The Japanese POW women had been seated in silence for so long that the sound of wooden basins being placed on the ground startled them like a crack of thunder. Their bodies were gaunt, shoulders sharp beneath tattered cloth, and their backs curved inward as though years of deprivation had bent them permanently. When the American medics carried in the first bucket of warm water, steam rising like a thin veil into the humid camp air, every woman within sight stiffened. The warmth drifting toward them seemed unreal, almost forbidden, as if comfort was a luxury they no longer had permission to feel. One woman instinctively recoiled, pressing her back to the splintered wall of the barracks, thinking it was a misunderstanding or perhaps a punishment disguised as a gift. She was not alone in her fear. Beside her, another woman leaned forward just slightly, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. Her hair, once long and dark, had become a stiff, tangled mass clinging to her skull. Months of sweat and dust had turned strands into something closer to rope than hair. Her fingers twitched toward the steam but stopped halfway, suspended in the air as if touching it might break her. She squinted at the basin, her mind struggling to connect the sight before her with the memory of what warm water used to feel like, a memory fading so deeply it no longer felt like something she had lived, but something she had once overheard in a story. American medics, aware of the trauma that clung to every gesture and breath inside that barracks, moved slowly, carefully. Their footsteps were soft, deliberate, the soles of their boots pressing gently into the packed dirt so as not to make a sound that might trigger fear. One of them, a young man who looked too gentle to exist in a place marked by war, knelt down and lowered the basin to the ground. He did not hold eye contact for long, just enough to convey empathy, not authority. He stepped back, raising his hands slightly in a universal display of peace. The women watched him retreat with a mix of suspicion and confusion. They had seen soldiers approach before, but never with gestures meant to comfort. The basin sat there, quietly steaming. Its warmth hovered just above the rim, curling into the air where it caught the fading sunlight. The fragrance surprised them most, a mild, clean scent, the unmistakable smell of soap. Not harsh disinfectant, not rotting wood, not sweat, or decay. Soap. Even the faintest trace of it pierced through the stale odor that had become their constant environment. It slipped into their senses with a gentleness they barely remembered, stirring something buried deep beneath weeks of terror. One of the older women inhaled sharply and brought her hand to her mouth, as if trying to contain the emotion rising in her chest. No one moved for a long moment. The only sounds came from outside: the distant clatter of mess tins, the low murmur of guards exchanging words, the faint groaning of barbed wire trembling in the wind. Inside the barracks, however, silence reigned. It was the heavy, suffocating kind of silence that settles over people who have been stripped of choice for too long. Freedom, even in the form of warm water, felt like a trap they didn't know how to respond to. Then, slowly, the youngest among them shifted her weight and pushed herself forward. She had been sitting cross-legged with her arms wrapped around her knees, her forehead pressed against her skin as if trying to hide in her own bones. Now she lifted her head, revealing dirt-streaked cheeks that glistened with the beginnings of tears. She reached a hand out, not toward the water at first, but toward the air above it, her fingers trembling violently. She held it there, inches from the rising steam, as if asking permission from the universe to continue. When the warmth finally touched her skin, her reaction was immediate. Her breath hitched, her lips parted, and her entire body quivered. Behind her, another woman let out a small, broken sound, something between a gasp and a sob. For months they had been washed by rainwater when it fell, by cold puddles when desperate, by anything that resembled moisture. Bathing had become an act of survival, not cleansing. And even those chances were scarce. Warm water was not merely unfamiliar, it was unimaginable. The young woman dipped her fingertips into the basin. The warmth shocked her. She jerked her hand back as though she had touched fire, but this time the gasp that escaped her lips was accompanied by tears that spilled freely down her cheeks. She stared at her wet fingers, rubbing them together slowly, feeling the slippery softness of soap running across her cracked skin. It was too much. Memories she had buried: the smell of her mother's kitchen, the gentle warmth of a bath drawn before school, the feeling of clean sheets flooded into her like a river breaking through a shattered dam. She covered her mouth as sobs began to escape her in uneven bursts. "Is this really for us?" she whispered. Her voice was thin, hoarse from dehydration and disuse, yet the words carried through the barracks like a spark catching dry leaves. Several women bowed their heads. Some closed their eyes. Others stared at the basin as though it were a miracle placed before them. After what felt like an eternity, the eldest among them, a woman with deep lines carved into her face and eyes clouded by exhaustion, leaned forward on her knees. Her hands, swollen from malnutrition, reached toward the basin with painful slowness. Her fingers brushed the surface of the water. She held them there, unmoving, letting warmth seep into her skin. A soft cry slipped from her lips, followed by another, and soon her shoulders were shaking uncontrollably. One by one, the women began moving closer, drawn not by command but by the primal need for relief. They kneeled in a tight circle around the basin, touching the water as if they were touching something divine. Dirt dissolved into the warm surface, turning the water cloudy almost immediately. But that did not matter. It wasn't about cleanliness alone. It was about the sensation of being cared for, even by strangers. It was about being seen as human. The steam drifted upward, washing over their hollow faces like a blessing. The women washed slowly, reverently, their motions fragile and uncertain. The first handfuls of water that touched their faces carried streaks of brown, gray, and black, trails of grime and exhaustion cascading down their cheeks like melted history. Some closed their eyes completely, letting the water soak their lashes. Others whispered prayers under their breath, old words learned in childhood, spoken now as a plea for strength. Outside, the American medics stood back several paces, giving them space, their expressions solemn. None of them spoke. They had seen wounded soldiers, amputations, disease, hunger. But they had never seen this women so starved of dignity that soap and warm water brought them to their knees in tears. One medic rubbed the back of his neck, swallowing hard. Another looked down at the ground, unable to watch without his own eyes burning. Inside the barracks, the women's sobs turned quieter, more controlled. Relief mixed with disbelief. For some, washing their faces felt like reclaiming a part of themselves that captivity had stolen. Others washed their hands again and again, as if trying to remove not just dirt but months of fear engraved into their skin. One woman cupped her hands together, holding the water carefully before pressing it against her cheeks. She exhaled sharply, and the breath trembled out of her body. She dipped her hands again, watching the ripples spread across the basin. For the first time in months, she recognized her reflection, not fully, not clearly, but enough to remember she was still alive. Another woman reached for a thin bar of soap floating in the water. She touched it lightly, as though afraid it might break. When she rubbed it between her palms, bubbles formed, small, delicate, shining with a faint iridescence in the fading daylight. She stared at them with awe. Her lips curled into a smile, not a wide one, not a confident one, but the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in months. The scent of the soap lifted through the barracks, weaving between them like a gentle breeze. It mingled with the rising steam, forming a pocket of warmth in a place otherwise defined by coldness and brutality. The women inhaled deeply. Some closed their eyes, savoring the smell. Others leaned closer, drawn by the comforting reminder of home. The first basin emptied quickly as the water turned darker. The medics stepped forward again, pouring in another bucket just as warm, just as gentle. This time, the women did not recoil. They watched the water flow in a slow, shimmering stream, feeling its promise wash over them even before they touched it. When they dipped their hands again, the cries were softer, but the emotion just as deep. A few women splashed water onto their arms, watching mud and sweat peel away like old paint. Others washed behind their ears, along their necks, over their eyelids. One woman massaged her scalp with trembling fingers, loosening clumps of dirt that had hardened into her hair. Each movement was deliberate, careful, respectful of the small gift they had been given. And slowly, very slowly, the atmosphere shifted. The barracks, once heavy with silence and despair, now filled with the gentle, rhythmic sound of water being lifted and dropped, lifted and dropped. It was a soft symphony, fragile, quiet, but undeniably human. Their breathing steadied. Their bodies relaxed. For a brief moment, the prison walls seemed to fade into the background. They were still starving. They were still prisoners. They were still uncertain of tomorrow. But for the first time in 6 months, they felt clean. Warm water slid down their faces, catching the last light of day. Their tears mixed with the basin water, their grief dissolving into the surface like ink spreading in a pool. And in that moment, small, fragile, and painfully human, they let themselves hope again. As the faint sounds of water and quiet sobbing spread through the barracks, it didn't take long for the rest of the POW camp to stir. In the dimming evening light, figures began to appear at the edges of the ruined doorways, thin silhouettes leaning cautiously forward, trying to understand what was happening inside. At first, they kept their distance, as though crossing the open ground between the shadows and the bathhouses was a risk they weren't certain they could take. But then the scent of warm water, soap, and rising steam drifted outward, carried by a gentle breeze that cut through the stagnant air of the camp. It spread like news whispered from one soul to another. Women turned their heads, listening. Others rose shakily from where they had been sitting on the ground for hours. Wordless curiosity pulled them closer, step by step. For months, the camp had been eerily quiet at nightfall. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy silence of exhaustion, a silence forced by hunger, illness, and the knowledge that any sound might draw unwanted attention. But now the quiet had changed. It had shifted from fearful stillness to an almost tentative alertness, a cautious hope rising under the surface. Something was happening. Something different. And that difference radiated through the camp with the warmth of a small flame trying to ignite in a forest drenched by rain. From the darker corners of the huts, more Japanese women stepped out. Some leaned heavily on the walls for support. Others held onto the shoulders of those walking beside them. They were malnourished, their bones visible beneath pale, bruised skin. Their clothing hung in tatters, stiff with dirt and sweat. But their eyes, though dulled by suffering, glimmered faintly as they gazed toward the makeshift bathhouses glowing softly under the lanterns. Their steps were slow, uneven, but determined, pulled forward by something deeper than simple curiosity. They were pulled by memory. By longing. By the faint promise of feeling human again. The medics outside were working tirelessly. They moved with urgent coordination, fueled not by orders but by the gravity of the moment unfolding before them. One team gathered firewood and fed it into metal drums to heat water. Another carried buckets from the flames to the bath stations, their hands red from holding the hot metal handles. Sweat rolled down their foreheads, soaking into their uniform collars, but none of them stopped. The rhythm of their movements formed a quiet pulse in the camp, the steady drumbeat of compassion. Inside the canvas-walled bathhouses, lanterns flickered with warm yellow light, casting gentle shadows on the wooden planks. It wasn't much. It wasn't polished. The walls were uneven, the nails hammered in quickly, the wood scavenged from damaged supply crates and broken furniture. The canvas roofs rippled softly in the wind. Yet despite its crude construction, this place felt like sanctuary, a fragile sanctuary built not of stone or steel, but of intention to restore something war had taken. The women who had already entered stood near the basins, washing slowly. They used water sparingly, mindful of how precious it was. Their motions were quiet and deliberate. Each splash echoed with significance. For months, they had survived on sips of water that barely wet their tongues. Many had gone days without washing even their hands. Their skin bore the marks of that deprivation, dry, cracked, layered with grime. Now, with each handful of warm water they lifted to their faces, the dirt dissolved, running down their cheeks like streaks of melted clay. They scrubbed behind their ears, along the nape of their necks, between their fingers. Some reached up with shaking hands to untangle their hair, wincing at the knots that resisted them. Yet even that pain felt sacred. Then more women entered, stepping past the threshold with reverence. Some cried openly upon seeing the steam rising inside the bath area. Others hesitated near the entrance, unsure if they were allowed to proceed, as if expecting someone to suddenly shout or punish them for stepping forward. They hovered there in limbo until a medic, noticing their uncertainty, gently motioned them in. His gesture was soft, wordless, and patient, an invitation rather than command. And that made all the difference. When they entered, the room filled more completely, the air thickening with warmth and human presence. Steam curled around their faces and drifted upward, softening the harsh lantern light. The women ran their fingers along the edges of the basins, feeling the smoothness of the wood. Some tapped the sides lightly, listening to the hollow sound, confirming it wasn't an illusion. Others dipped their palms into the water, letting the warmth seep into their skin slowly. Their reactions were mixed gasps, tears, long exhalations. For many, the sensation of warmth on their skin was overwhelming. It was not simply physical comfort, it was emotional release. One woman in her mid-30s, her cheeks sunken and her collarbones sharply defined, stepped toward a basin with visibly trembling legs. She reached into the water and paused, staring at her own reflection rippling across the surface. It had been months since she had seen her face clearly. Now she traced the line of her jaw with wet fingertips, rubbing away the dirt that had hidden her from herself. Her expression softened, her lips quivering. She did not cry loudly, her tears fell in silence, streaming into the basin. Another woman, older, perhaps in her late 40s, went further. She took a cloth handed to her by a medic and dipped it deeply into the basin. Then she pressed it against her cheeks, her forehead, her neck, scrubbing with slow, deliberate strokes. The water darkened quickly from the layers of accumulated grime. But she continued, her breath steady and controlled, as though committing a quiet ritual. With each wipe, her skin appeared lighter, her features clearer, her expression more alive. She closed her eyes and whispered something too softly to hear, perhaps a prayer of gratitude, perhaps a memory, perhaps nothing more than a sound her heart could no longer contain. Meanwhile, outside the bathhouses, the lanterns glowed like beacons in the approaching night. The medics and soldiers continued carrying out their tasks with a solemn respect. They rarely spoke. When they did, their words were hushed, mindful of the fragile peace inside. They understood, even without being told, that something important was happening, something that transcended the war they were fighting. There was a moral gravity to the work, a sense that these small acts of kindness were repairing invisible wounds far deeper than any of them could fully comprehend. More women gathered outside, waiting their turn with a mixture of eagerness and disbelief. Some sat on the ground, hugging their knees for support. Others clutched at their sleeves, as though holding themselves in place was the only thing keeping them from collapsing. They watched the steam rising from the bathhouses with wide eyes, their bodies leaning subtly toward the warmth. The glow from the lanterns reflected in their pupils, giving them a faint, haunting shine. Inside the bathhouses, the atmosphere grew more vibrant. One woman began to hum softly, hesitantly, almost inaudibly. It was a tune she likely hadn't sung in years, perhaps one she barely remembered. But the melody, faint as it was, carried through the steam. Another woman recognized it and let out a small sigh. Then another joined in, humming the next note. The song was fragile, unsteady, but it was music in a place where silence had been the only constant for too long. The sound blended with the dripping water, the rustle of canvas, the crackling lanterns. It became a kind of temporary refuge, a reminder of the lives they once lived. The medics carrying water paused in their work to listen. The quiet hum floated out of the bathhouses and drifted into the night like a memory returning home. One soldier, young and barely past 20, swallowed hard and looked away toward the treeline, blinking back emotion he didn't want the others to see. Inside, the washing continued. As they cleaned their arms and legs, many women took time to simply feel the texture of their own skin again. They touched their shoulders, their faces, their hair, reacquainting themselves with the parts of their bodies they hadn't been allowed to care for. Others helped one another untangling knots from hair, wiping dirt from someone's back, handing a cloth across the basin. Despite years of suffering, the instinct to care for one another had not disappeared, it had simply been buried, waiting for a moment when compassion could surface. Outside, the darkness grew deeper. Stars began to appear faintly in the sky, twinkling through breaks in the clouds. The camp, once bleak and cold, now seemed alive with warm light. Lanterns cast a golden glow along the ground, illuminating the faces of women waiting in line. Their expressions were tired but hopeful, etched with quiet anticipation. Some leaned forward to catch glimpses of those emerging from the bathhouses, watching as women stepped out with damp hair clinging to their temples, their skin cleaner, their faces calmer. And the reactions were always the same: a soft gasp, a fading whisper, or tears rising unbidden in their eyes. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The women who emerged looked lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Their posture straightened slightly. Their steps gained a fraction more steadiness. Their eyes, though still tired, still hollow, held a spark that had not been there before. Where moments earlier there had been dull resignation, now there was something else. Something fragile, but bright. Humanity. One woman exiting the bathhouse paused at the doorway and turned back to look inside. She clasped her hands together at her chest and bowed deeply, not toward a person but toward the space itself. It had given her something she thought she might never feel again: dignity. The medics working outside noticed her bow. One of them instinctively nodded back, his throat tightening. He turned away quickly, pretending to adjust a lantern, but his hands shook slightly as he did. Back inside, the washing continued. The water in the basins grew dark with dirt, prompting the medics to replace it again and again. Each time fresh hot water poured in, steam rose in a soft cloud, drifting through the lantern light like mist rolling across a quiet lake. The women leaned into it, letting the warmth settle onto their skin. Some of them washed their faces over and over, as if afraid the dirt might return if they paused. Others simply rested their hands on the rim of the basin, feeling the soaked wood beneath their palms. A few stared at the water, mesmerized by the ripples, their minds lost in memories of home, memories they had not allowed themselves to touch for months. The atmosphere was one of gentle renewal. No one rushed. No one raised their voice. No one imposed authority. The space belonged to the women, the first thing that had belonged to them in a very long time. Outside, the camp had changed. Where there had been despair, there was now quiet hope. Where there had been silence, there were now soft voices, hums, and the sound of water falling off hands and cloth. The lanterns continued to glow like warm stars fallen to earth. And beneath that light, war momentarily loosened its grip. The act of bathing, simple, ordinary, everyday, became something extraordinary. It was not about luxury. It was not about comfort. It was about restoration. About reminding these women that they were still human, still worthy of care, still alive in a world that had tried to bury them under suffering. And as the night deepened and the medics carried yet another bucket of steaming water to refill the basins, the scene inside the camp became something no one present would forget, a moment where compassion broke through the brutality of war, where the smallest gesture became a lifeline, and where hope, quiet, trembling, fragile, found its way back into the hearts of those who needed it most. The night deepened around the camp, but inside the bathhouses, time seemed suspended, measured not by hours or the fading light, but by the slow, deliberate movements of women rediscovering themselves. The first had emerged, stepping carefully onto the soft dirt outside, water still clinging to her hair in heavy, damp strands, and she paused, letting the cool night air brush against her wet skin. The sensation was startling, almost too intense, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat and filth that had enveloped her for months. She raised her hands to her face, feeling the contours of her cheeks, tracing lines long hidden beneath grime, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she recognized the face staring back at her. It was her own, unmistakably, though altered by suffering. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the gauntness of her frame, something extraordinary shone, recognition of her own humanity. Behind her, others followed, some supported by companions, others leaning on the remnants of the wooden structures for balance. Each step was tentative, careful, but marked by an almost imperceptible confidence, a reclaiming of agency in a world that had stripped it from them. Their wet hair clung to shoulders and necks, dripping onto the worn ground, leaving small puddles that reflected the soft lantern light in fragmented patterns, like shattered memories catching brief illumination. The air was thick with the scent of soap, warm wood, and faint smoke from the fires still burning to heat water. This mixture, subtle but powerful, carried an emotional weight far beyond mere fragrance. It was a scent that whispered of care, of protection, of kindness extended in a world where cruelty had been the default. As more women emerged from the bathhouses, the scene began to take on a rhythm. One woman, older, with skin mottled by years of exposure and neglect, lowered herself onto a makeshift stool outside the wooden frame. She closed her eyes and pressed her palms together, a silent gesture of gratitude or prayer, or perhaps both. The steam still rising around her caught the lantern light, surrounding her in a soft haze that gave her the appearance of being somewhere not bound by war or imprisonment, but in a world temporarily free from suffering. Her fingers traced patterns over her damp hair, now somewhat untangled, and for a moment she simply inhaled deeply, as though trying to internalize the entire sensation. The warmth, the cleanliness, the simple act of being able to touch oneself without fear, it was a miracle of quiet magnitude. She let out a soft exhalation, and the tension coiled in her shoulders began to ease. A fellow prisoner, nearby, glanced at her and offered a tentative smile, and in that instant, a fragile connection, forged in shared experience, was made visible. The younger women who had entered the bathhouses first now circulated among those waiting outside, offering hands to steady companions, sharing small cloths to dry their skin or brush residual soap from damp hair. Their movements were careful, intentional, almost ceremonial. There was no rush, no frantic energy, only the slow unfolding of a profound realization, that they were being cared for without expectation, that this was not punishment disguised as aid, nor a trap designed to humiliate, but a genuine act of humanity extended in the midst of chaos. Some of them bent to help untangle hair that had matted into knots so severe it had formed near impenetrable tangles, and each successful stroke of the fingers felt like liberation, a small but critical victory over months of neglect and deprivation. The medics, standing a respectful distance away, allowed themselves quiet observation. They had seen horrors of war, the twisted remains of machinery, the broken bodies of soldiers, the aftermath of battles that left scars both visible and hidden, but this intimate and profound human experience, struck them differently. They did not speak, understanding that words could intrude on a sacred moment. They only moved when necessary, carrying fresh buckets of warm water, adjusting lanterns, or stepping in briefly to guide a woman's hand to the basin. Even such interventions were soft, deliberate, infused with a careful consideration born from years of understanding how fragile hope can be. Inside the bathhouses, the ritual continued. Each basin was now in use, women washing with deliberate thoroughness, some kneeling, some bending over the edges to let water run over their shoulders and down their backs. The darkness outside seemed to heighten the intimacy of the act. It was as if the canvas walls created a separate world, a bubble of warmth and security where the rules of suffering no longer applied. Their movements, though quiet, carried with them stories of months of starvation, of humiliation, of fear, of bodies left unclean and unrecognized. And as the water ran and fell, carrying away the visible dirt, the intangible burden seemed to follow. Shoulders straightened imperceptibly, backs unfurled, heads lifted. The act of washing became symbolic, a reclamation of identity, a tangible way to assert, I still exist. I am still here. Outside, the remaining women, too frail to move quickly, watched with a mixture of anticipation, reverence, and disbelief. They whispered softly among themselves, voices tremulous, sharing quiet affirmations or tentative encouragements. The anticipation itself was electric, the smell of soap and water drawing them forward like an irresistible call. Some craned their necks from the barracks, trying to see what awaited them, seeing only faint outlines of women emerging from the mist and light. Each emerging figure seemed a beacon of what was possible, that survival was not merely about sustaining life, but about reclaiming humanity. In these moments, subtle patterns of camaraderie and shared understanding emerged. The women began to assist one another not out of obligation, but because the desire to lift someone else's burden had not been erased by suffering. One offered a cloth to another's trembling hands, a small gesture of shared comfort. Another helped steady a woman's back as she stepped carefully across uneven ground. And yet another held a basin steady while a fellow prisoner scrubbed away months of neglect. These acts, small in isolation, became a collective testimony to resilience, compassion, and interdependence, an unspoken promise that even in captivity, in the darkest times, they could still care for one another. The younger prisoners, who had been more hesitant initially, now moved with confidence, each step reinforcing the growing sense of communal healing. They mimicked the gentle motions they observed, learned from those just emerging from the bathhouses, and soon the ritual became layered with subtle guidance and support. Their voices, previously reserved and fearful, began to carry quiet instructions, soft reminders to take care, gentle cautions to avoid slipping, and murmured words of encouragement. In these hushed exchanges, the camp witnessed the flowering of leadership born of survival and empathy, of experience tempered by the knowledge of what suffering could do if left unchecked. The steam rising from the warm water carried with it the faint scent of the women themselves' sweat, perfume from past lives, the underlying metallic scent of blood and exhaustion. Yet now, mingled with soap and warmth, it formed a kind of olfactory symphony that filled the night with an intangible sense of renewal. The lanterns, flickering softly against the canvas walls, cast shadows that danced across the faces of women engaged in this quiet renaissance. Each flicker emphasized the subtle changes, the faint smile breaking across lips, the soft exhalation of breath, the relaxed arch of shoulders once tightened by months of misery. The interplay of light and shadow became a visual metaphor for the emotional transformation unfolding within, the darkness giving way, piece by piece, to fragile illumination. Occasionally, a woman would pause mid-motion, her eyes closing as she allowed herself to simply feel. A hand would rest against her own cheek, tracing the outline of a jaw or the bridge of her nose. A fingertip would brush over the hollow of a collarbone or the ridge of a knuckle. Each gesture was slow, reverent, deliberate, an act of rediscovery. Their bodies, long subjected to deprivation, were being acknowledged once more as vessels of life and dignity, and with each small movement, a wave of quiet triumph passed among the group, an invisible, collective recognition that survival extended beyond mere sustenance, into recognition of the self and of each other. Outside, the night deepened further. The stars became brighter, a pinprick of light against a darkening sky. The camp, previously a space of fear and fatigue, now seemed to pulse with quiet energy. Each emerging figure from the bathhouses carried with her a ripple of hope, a subtle reminder to those still waiting that care could exist even in the midst of chaos. The movement of bodies, water, and air combined to create a scene that, while modest in scale, resonated with profound meaning, a tableau of human resilience and restoration, both physical and spiritual. As the hours passed, more women took turns emerging, washing, and stepping into the night air. Some paused to help the next in line, their hands gentle but firm, offering support and reassurance. Others simply stood, arms lifted to wring out damp hair, faces tilted toward the lantern light. The simple act of cleanliness, so ordinary in normal circumstances, had been transformed into a sacred ritual, a shared reclamation of life itself. In the quiet, the camp seemed to breathe with them, expanding to accommodate the space for this collective healing. For a few hours, the weight of war, captivity, and neglect was suspended, replaced by the subtle, yet undeniable, force of human compassion. And when the last of the women had stepped from the bathhouses that night, the camp settled into an almost reverent silence. There were no jubilant cries, no loud laughter, no triumphal fanfare. Only the soft sounds of water dripping from damp hair, the occasional sigh of contentment, and the faint rustle of cloth as bodies adjusted to newfound cleanliness. Each woman, for herself, had reclaimed a fragment of dignity long denied. And together, as a group, they had forged a fleeting, yet powerful, testament to the endurance of spirit even in the harshest conditions. For the American medics who observed this quiet culmination, the memory would linger indefinitely. They had entered the camp expecting to fulfill duty, perhaps alleviate suffering in small ways, yet what they witnessed transcended procedural care. They had watched humanity rise from deprivation, resilience bloom amidst despair, and the simple, unadorned act of bathing become a transformative experience. Each ripple in the water, each soft exhalation, each glint of understanding in weary eyes became a story of survival, endurance, and the enduring power of compassion. By the time the moon climbed fully into the sky, casting pale light across the tents and ruined barracks, a quiet peace had settled over the camp. The women, freshly bathed and illuminated by lanterns and moonlight alike, gathered in small clusters, speaking softly to one another, sharing brief words, small smiles, gestures of connection. Their faces, clean for the first time in months, reflected relief and astonishment, and a fragile but undeniable glimmer of hope. The night had shifted from darkness to something resembling renewal, and the lessons of that moment, the significance of care amidst destruction, would remain etched in memory far longer than the war itself.